Hi, I'm Anna Berger. I am the chair of the Cornell University New Conversations Project Board, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Citizen Journal and New Conversation Project discussion today on private regulation and does it work? Big hot topic that we're going to be able to spend some time not only having a great discussion between Eddie and Sarosh, but also having you have the opportunity to ask some questions. So the New Conversations Project started a few years ago because we actually believe that after 30 years of agitation to try to improve the lives of workers in the global supply chain, we were still failing to be able to do that systemically and across having any long-term sustainability. So we hope that we could bring together stakeholders from different perspectives, with different ideas, to the same table to try to have new conversations about new solutions. And it's grounded in data and analysis, so we can look at things differently together and try to figure out how to solve the problem of improving workers' lives. So that's been an incredibly exciting time, and over the last few years, we've been fortunate to get access to data. And I'd now like to introduce the two speakers today. Sarosh Kuruvilla, my academic partner and lead at Cornell University, the professor of industrial relations, Asian studies, and public affairs at Cornell. He joined Cornell faculty in 1990 after obtaining a doctorate degree in business administration from the University of Iowa in 1989. And after a career as a labor relations manager in the industries in India. His research is largely focused on national human resources and labor policies in Asia, and he's also done work with Asian governments. He currently directs the New Conversations Project and is focused on sustainable labor standards in global supply chains here at Cornell. And Eddie Hertzman is the founder and president of Sourcing Journal. He was trained at NYU as an economist, then spent more than a decade working as a top executive of major sourcing companies all over the world, including Synergies Worldwide and Pearl Global. He founded Sourcing Journal in 2009, and now it's one of the largest trade journals devoted to the sourcing, apparel, and textile industry supply chain in the world. He's now the executive vice president of the Fairchild Media and continues to lead the day-to-day operations of the Sourcing Journal. I'd now like to turn it over to Eddie to begin this conversation.
I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to partake in today's webinar. So first, I think congratulations is due, Sarosh, on the launch of your book, Private Regulation in Global Supply Chains, Problems, Progress, and Prospects. My first question really is, what was your inspiration for writing this book? What interests you about the apparel and the private regulation in this sector? It's not something that you see too often written about.
Yeah, so like all stories begin with this idea of two guys walking into a bar, right? And so I was in a bar when I got this message from Cornell University. It was a bar in London. I got this message from Cornell University saying, look, we have been approached by a company to ask us to do research on this. And this was, and you need to go and see the John Oliver show. So I promptly went back home and saw the John Oliver show. And there in that show, John Oliver is talking about 4 or 5 garment companies and how they have these private regulation programs, which lays out conditions for workers in the supply chain, and how even after 25 years, those programs are not working. And every once in a while, you have this disaster, you have fires, you have safety issues. And so, it struck me about, why is it? Everybody normally believes that the private sector is super efficient, right? Much better than the public sector can do. And so I was sort of saying, yeah, these guys, the private sector, they're big global companies, and they've been doing this for 25 years. And how come we still see these things happening? And so that was the motivation. That was what got me the trigger for sort of saying, yeah, so maybe this is a project I can try to do. Yeah, so that's how I got started.
So, it's interesting. I've been reading a lot of the articles you've been writing over the past, 6 months. You have this opinion, this thesis that really not much has changed in the industry over the past, 10 or 20 years. My question is, Rana Plaza, and all of us remember, was such a horrific event. And since then, so much emphasis has been put on not just labor regulations, but also, building inspections. Do you really believe that in this past decade, nothing has really progressed at all? It's just a narrative what the brands want us to believe. On the factory side, there's been no progress.
So, the first problem I had when starting the project was to sort of say, okay, I need to do research on this, but I need to do research, I need data. I need to know what's going on. And the problem was that there wasn't any data because this is private regulation, remember? So the companies that do this stuff don't have to share it. Right? So they can make claims saying, we've done this, we've got a program, this is working. And in some cases it does, in some few cases it does. But I was trying to get comprehensive data on the aggregate. And finally, I did manage to get data from an auditing company that does audits for a number of different organizations. And so that gave me comprehensive industry data based on 30, 40,000 audits they've done over a 7-8 year period. And when I look at that data, I'm finding that the number of violations, code of conduct has X number of conditions in it, and the auditors go and see to what extent factories violate those conditions. And if you look at those number of violations, they have remained steady over the 7-year period in which Rana Plaza was in the middle. In fact, for some items like labor issues, the number of violations has actually increased in the aggregate. So that was why I made the claim, sort of saying, hey, we're not seeing improvement over time. And I'm not new in making that claim because there was a guy called Richard Locke, Professor Locke, who studied this in Nike way back from the 2000s and found that, throughout the decade of the 2000s, the distribution of factories with percentage grades on violations hadn't changed much. So I felt a little more confident. And then, in order to be doubly sure, I went back and looked at factories that have been audited multiple times over the 4-year period, following the same factories over time. And I found that there too, there's no improvement. It's like giving the patient enough medicine, but the patient is not responding to treatment, right? So that's what led me to believe that in the aggregate, you don't see much improvement, but there are definitely specific cases of good improvement.
Do you think one of the problems is that each brand or retailer, and especially if you start going now international, it gets much more complex, really has their own manual that they ship to the factory and they call it the quote unquote XYZ brand, compliance guidelines. And I joke with people, the factory could be Eddie Hertzman compliant and all I could require you to do is have a roof on there, but I could say, oh, it's compliant. So does this create a lot of confusion and unnecessary cost and burden on the factories who are already, look what happened this past year. Okay, we like to use the word partnership, but we all know the factories are always at the wrong end of that equation. The margins continually get compressed at the factory end. So all of this testing and auditing and testing often comes at the burden of the factory. A lot of times they say, look, if you're not XYZ compliant, we won't even place an order with you. Do you think we need some pre-competitive collaboration here? We need a set of guidelines that we could agree upon as an industry. Let's forget getting the government involved. If we could even just do it within the industry, would that be a step in the right direction?
Yeah, in two ways. It would be a step in the right direction in two ways. So the first way is if you look at this point from look at this point of view from the factory side, right? So we have this factory, we know this factory, a big supplier, and they supply to 70 global brands, like the really big guys. And they are a very top-notch supplier, but each of those 70 global brands comes to their factory and audits them more than 30 times a year. And it's the same thing. Each of the brands has certain things that they're particular about. One brand is particular about safety, one brand is particular about this. They send in their auditors, each of those auditors gives you a vastly different rating. They look for different things, they find different things, they give you a different rating. Just like 4 or 5 professors, 70 professors rating a student and all of them finding vastly different, giving the student a different, vastly different grades, right? So there's a multiplicity of programs going on in the same factory, right? And so that's one problem. On the other side, these brands could save a hell of a lot of money if they all collaborated and just did one audit. One big, solid audit. Let's say it takes 2 weeks. It's still less than what they're currently auditing all those 70 together, right? And so that requires brand-to-brand collaboration. And there we are trying to solve a conceptual problem that has bedeviled this industry for a long time, and that is, how do you create cooperation, and collaboration in a competitive environment? Because these brands are actually competing with each other, and that is the problem we need to solve.
Yeah. I want to pivot to a different question, but we'll go back to this. I'm not going to name the brands, but I'll never forget this story. It was a kid's order for denim, and I was already running late. And a few days before the shipment, I get a phone call from my factory. They said, "We got bad news. We failed the lead test on the buttons." I'm like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? I have no more extensions left. We're going to probably have to air the goods. But even if you do that, I have a failed lead test. Give us 24 hours. The next day they call me and they say, "Good news, Eddie, we passed the lead test. We're airing the goods tomorrow." I said, I don't know, is this magic buttons? Did the lead disappear? Now, what I'm getting at is, and I never really know the true story, but when you're talking about a part of the world, developing countries where, this phone right here represents 6 months of salary or 3 months of salary, I could bribe someone with this phone. Let's be very candid here for a second. You're not going to lose your job by me trying to give you an iPhone. But in parts of the world where someone makes $100 a month, for $100, you could probably get them to change an audit. I know you've written a lot about, there's actually organizations in China whose sole purpose is to almost falsify documentation.
Yeah.
So how do you combat this type of, how do you get around this? These are realities that we're dealing with every day.
Right. So first, let me talk about the endless amount of falsification of data and why that occurs. So there is a lot. You're right. There is an entire industry in China that makes its living helping factories pass the audits so that these factories can get orders from big brands, right? And in so doing, one of the key things that they provide is this one-click software that manufactures payroll and worker data, to sort of show to falsify data. So that's very common. We've always known that this occurs. It's just that the scale of what is happening is quite astounding. So the question is, why does this occur? I mean, it occurs because there is, at the moment, an adversarial relationship between buyer and supplier. So the buyer, on the one hand, is squeezing the supplier on the cost, and at the same time telling the supplier, we need you to do X, Y, and Z, and be perfectly compliant. And sometimes that equation doesn't gel, right? And so what is really required to solve this is not additional policing, because more policing, you can always find your way around the policing system. So what requires is some degree of trust, and that degree of trust is built on the basis of supplier-buyer collaboration and partnerships. So, in many other industries, lead firms and their suppliers work together, and in a partnership-oriented model. It's, in autos, it is Ford and Visteon, it's Toyota and its suppliers. And so there has to be a system where brands and suppliers work together in ways where the supplier is guaranteed a little bit of a long-term outlook, a little bit of a long-term business. And where there's some agreement that they will share in good times and they will both suffer in bad times at the same time, to keep that long-term stuff going on. I think that's crucial. And the few cases of success that I had is where a brand has told its supplier, look, we're going to stick with you for the next 6 years, right? But in those 6 years, we will guarantee you orders, but we need you to improve on these aspects of compliance. And they've done that. as long as there's, so there's a sense of partnership model there that isn't prevalent in a very transactionally oriented apparel industry.
Right. Well, you bring up the auto industry. It's interesting because you have a dozen and a half companies who make, again, a dozen cars a year. And that supply chain is pretty fixed for the period of time. They know exactly the parts, they have exactly that supply chain, and it's going down that line. You look at an apparel company, thousands of SKUs changing every week, every season. They have tier 1 suppliers, tier 2, tier 3, nominated trims coming from here, shipping here, going here. There's so many, even if the factory's compliant, is the fabric compliant, mill compliant? Is the spinning, it's Pandora's box. You could keep uncovering problem after problem after problem. And where do you start? Where do you end when you're trying to, for a company that's trying to get on the right side of this? Most people start at the finishing factory, where the garment's being shipped from. But once you go backwards, okay, well, that factory may not be dyeing. It may not be doing the embroidery. It's not doing the spinning. So you've diagnosed the problem, but how would you start to go about, other than some pre-collaborative pre-competitive collaboration, how do you start to tackle this problem in such a way that it's not overwhelming for these brands and retailers?
Right. So, couple of different thoughts here. One is that this entire focus on private regulation in the apparel industry has only been on the first tier factory. Okay, so that's the end. And slowly now, in some companies are getting to the second tier, which is the fabric mills that make the product. So there's a long way to go if you want to go right back to the cotton fields, right? Which is where the supply chain really begins. It's like in the problem with Xinjiang cotton, right? None of the brands are able to figure out how much of their cotton actually comes from Xinjiang today. So that's
a problem.
So it's a big problem. Now there are a couple of things you can do to make a start. You're not going to solve this endless, the end point of the supply chain. But a couple of making a start is to look at some suppliers, for example, are fully vertically integrated towards the rest. So we know of a supplier that owns fabric mills that actually owns cotton fields too, right? And so you could focus on suppliers that have more vertically integrated systems. That's one option. The other option is to sort of, really go further on the collaboration model and sort of say, let's collaborate in the entire industry in a particular country and have all the brands sign on to a basic agreement that, they will maybe push collective bargaining at the level of the industry so you can get collective bargaining and wages. This is what a new experiment called ACT, which is comprised of 20 global brands, are trying to do in Indonesia. So I think that if you try to solve the problem at the level of the industry, you get more traction rather than trying to solve the problem at the level of each individual factory and each individual supply chain.
What role do you think third-party organizations like Fair Trade or Fairwear have in this conversation?
So there's a whole range of third-party organizations floating around in today's model. There are multi-stakeholder institutions like Fair Labor Association and Fairwear Foundation, right? On one hand, and there are fair trade, especially in apparel, where the fair trade model is to get buyers to pay a 10% premium or X% premium, which goes to the workers. This is also called program multiplicity. Each of these organizations exists for a purpose. They're funded for a purpose, and those purposes don't necessarily always align to focus on workers' lives in the supply chain. So there are lots of people playing around in the ecosystem, but they all don't speak with one voice. So organizing them, even the critical NGOs, there are like 7 or 8 of them that have been around for years, but try to get them together in the same room and say follow the same rules. So there's fragmentation where you need a little more unity in the ecosystem, and that's a problem in garments. But it's not as much of a problem in other industries, especially electronics.
So one of the things I like to say is that when the conversation starts to change, the labeling starts to change, right? We see this big with sustainability.
Yeah.
A lot of greenwashing, a lot of good washing happening. Do you think the industry's push on sustainability is overshadowing some of the compliance work that needs to be done? Or do you think there's a link between sustainability and compliance?
So, there's a lot of terms that we need to be clear about. Right? So when we started getting involved in the labor side of it back in the Nike days in 1990, the term was compliance, right? That was a term, and it was labor practice departments that Nike had at that point. Over a period of time, that kind of activity morphed into corporate social responsibility departments. And they began to do this, both looking at environment as well as labor. Today, the key word is sustainability, or ESG, and sustainability also focuses on environment and labor. So the labor part is generally called the S, this is social sustainability. I think the focus on the environment has taken a little bit of attention away from the focus on labor for two reasons. One is that the environment is something that broadly more people care about. And second, what brands do can easily be measured. It's just metrics. If a brand says, oh, I'm going to sort of now only focus on organic cotton, which uses less water, we get brownie points, good points for saving the environment. That's easily measurable. But it's much harder to measure whether, this factory has been suppressing unions for years and now it is sort of becoming more, collaborative, or do we know whether they're suppressing unions? Or do we know whether there's sexual harassment in a third world factory where 90% of the workers are women and all the managers are men, right? It's hard to figure those out. It's not easy metrics. Environment has easy metrics, so it's easier.
So now I want to start asking you a little bit more of the fastball questions. I think a lot of industries or a lot of companies survive in chaos. They actually like the chaos because once you have a standard and everyone is measured on it, then they have to comply. Right now, the industry is set up in such a way, like I said before, I have the Eddy metric, you have the Sarosh metric, we have this. What is the benefit for the industry to come together and say, hey, we want to get behind this? Because for the most part, they put the burden on the factory. In their file cabinet, they have a bunch of paperwork that the factory sign off on. A third-party inspector checks the box. And it's like an insurance policy. I did everything I needed to do. Why should I now blow that whole system up and become under intense scrutiny?
So these same brands did everything they were supposed to do. They had the audit reports, and you still had a Rana Plaza, and 1,000 workers died, right? And so now that's a horrible way to catalyze the good movement in the industry, right? You can't have people dying and sort of say that's the catalyst. We need alternative catalysts. And so there are alternative catalysts around the pike. And one of the biggest ones is this whole idea of mandatory due diligence legislation coming out in Europe. It's already come out in France, it has come out in Germany for the first time, where you can actually begin to sue a company for violating, conditions, the code of conduct and supply chain in another country. So that's a pretty good catalyst, I think. It might work. And the second is that, within the community of practitioners, there are lots of people inside companies who really want to make a difference. And I really, my hat's off to them for trying and trying and trying. And I think that all of these people, they are being evaluated by their own bosses on a regular basis. Where do they get their bonus? They get their bonus if there's improvement in the supply chain, right? In labor. If you're in charge of labor and the environment, you do well, So people are constantly searching for how to improve. the problem in this industry is there's a complete lack of disclosure about what best practices. What is working, where is it working, why is it working? And that's because all of these guys have data, but they're not analyzing it. And I'm sort of saying, look, the key message of my book is, look, let's get best practices out there. Let's get some data disclosure, without naming anybody, so that we can figure out what works. And I think that's a crucial element as well. In getting internal movement towards some collaboration.
Why is the audit information? I mean, you brought this up many times today, and even more so in your research. Why is the audit information so unreliable, though? Why can't they analyze the data, and why can't people make actionable, respond? Why can't they respond to that?
So partly, let's forget the case in which the company is falsifying the information given to the auditor. That's one thing.
Yeah.
The other thing is the audit information is not reliable because when auditing is outsourced, right, to an auditing company, and they're paid relatively little, as most outsourced operations are, you're doing it for reducing costs. Each auditor goes into the factory. Let's say you have 1,000 people factory, an auditor spends two auditors spending 2 days. That's the total, right? And in those 2 days, they got to do a complete audit of safety and health, chemical handling, fire extinguishers, all of the fire issues, and then, all the safety issues on the sewing machines, etc. That will at least take half a day, one person. Then another half a day is spent talking to workers. You're supposed to talk to workers about whether their rights are being suppressed. You're supposed to talk to workers about whether they're being sexually harassed, whether there's discrimination. That takes another day. It takes an entire day for 2 people sitting, pouring through records, right, to figure out if there's violation of leave, of all the labor issues, leave, days of working, overtime, etc., etc. 2 days is not enough to get the data, uncover real deep violations, the root causes of things. And then, of course, there's also the possibility that there's audit fraud going on. I mean, factory managers will pay the auditor. If he's not a company auditor, let's say somebody belonging to a Nike or something like that, who knows about collusion?
But do you feel that the workers are going to be honest? I mean, after Rana Plaza, people were interviewing workers, and they said they wish they could have go back to the building and work the next day because they need that food.
So in fact,
you look at what's going on with COVID. These people will risk their lives to make a living. So do you think if push comes to shove, someone comes in from the outside and says, what's going on here? Are you working overtime? Are you getting paid? They're ever going to be honest?
No, they're not. They're not. And so that's why some of the audit protocols people are talking about is, if you want to talk to workers, go to their communities. Don't talk to them in the factory. Right? Go to workers in the communities. But that's one thing. Maybe another entire radical solution, sort of say, okay, you have auditors, you have all this policing going on. Why don't you create a system where you empower those workers to do the policing? There's a new idea floating around called worker-driven social responsibility. Maybe workers can be part of the solution. Their voice has never been involved in any of this design of private regulation. It's possible.
Do you think part of the problem, and I hope I offend no one on the call, is a lot of the organizations overseas that represent the workers, that represent the factories, are run by who else? Factory owners.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, they have a political agenda, but they also have a business agenda, and that agenda is to make a lot of money. And so they may want to get minimum wage up just enough to be good in the press, to make a splash, but not enough that it impacts their 6 homes around the world. And so who is really fighting for the workers? When you're talking about people making $77, $80, $100 a month, these are people making millions and millions of dollars. Put COVID got really hurt during this period of time. But is it a mistake to put factory owners at the heart and center of some of these organizations? Do they have sometimes the wrong intentions?
So, it's assigning responsibility for something like this is a complex issue, right? Because there are complex actors, a number of actors in the chain. And so, I mean, yeah, the local state is key because the local state does have basic labor laws that it ought to be enforcing. So they have to be part of the conversation, part of the solution. I think the factory owners, we can, yeah, sure, factory owners want to make as much money as possible, but it is possible to make money with a slightly more high road approach rather than only by a low road approach. And good factories with good reputations, like we've seen in a couple of the suppliers we are currently studying, have no issue at all getting orders from global brands. In fact, they argue that it's because of our good reputation that brands come to us. And even though we don't have great relationships with them, they don't guarantee us orders. But some brands have been coming back to me for 17 years. And this is what these guys tell us. And those factories are pretty good. So, I think there's a way of ratcheting standards upwards as long as, we can get more and more brands collaborating to sort of, and sourcing from factories and countries where conditions are generally better. And that creates the incentive for everybody to move on.
There's so much that's still so price sensitive, especially in the States. You have sectors, and I'm not naming any names because a lot of them are very close to me, but let's just say there are a lot of Americans that shop at retailers that are extremely, extremely price sensitive. Whether it's a sector of retail, whether it's a sector of club stores, whether it's a sector of outlet stores, these are companies that need to save every penny humanly possible. They can't work at the creme de la creme factories. So they, by nature, are working at B and C grade factories. The question is, and even if we go to the Nikes of the world, is it their responsibility to pay for this? Or is it the factory's responsibility to have it in place? It's the chicken and the egg, because like I said before, a lot of times someone will say, I won't give you an order until you make this change to your factory, till you do this. And times people have called me and they said, Eddie, I got to put $100,000 investment into my factory with zero promise of orders. Now, if I don't do it, I have zero orders. If I do it, I still have zero orders, but at least I have the ability to get the orders. So again, the burden seems to always be on the factory. Do you think that's the appropriate way to go about this?
So the factories are in business to make money. And so the question is, what's their strategy of making money, right? I mean, do they follow the cut price logic, or are they going to sort of follow a logic that actually gets them long-term benefits? And I think that you see differences in factory owners in terms of how they think. In fact, one of the, you asked, I think you mentioned this earlier, what's the difference between really good factories and not so good factories? There's a huge difference. And so really good factories are not good because they have better machinery, or they're good because their owners and managers think differently about the job. And I have some really impressive research coming out. That is impressive because I look at those curves and sort of see to what extent does every improvement in factory systems, management systems quality actually improve compliance. And it's very, very significant. So I think there's factories and there are factories, and it's the thing that would be really useful for the brands is to be told, here is a model using your own data that can help you decide what makes it likely that a factory will be a more compliant one, a factory will be less likely to subcontract, unauthorized subcontract. And we have data and predictive models that can be created. But this requires that these global brands and collect the data from their private regulation programs, from their suppliers, analyze it and sort of say, look, there are some brands that have 2,000 factories around the world. And there's a lot of data about those factories. Why don't you put that data to use? What do you call this? Evidence-based decision making.
Right.
Analyze the data and sort of say, look, here's a set of factories that do good all the time. Why is that? Right? That's where I would like to go if I could. If companies were willing to share with me the data, then I would create more and more predictive models to answer these kinds of questions. And that's what's missing in this industry, this data focus.
Yeah, I mean, the one part of this where I would challenge a little bit is I think there are some retail groups that are using some technology today, and it's the network effect, right? You know, all the factories the retailer requires everyone to use these third-party platforms, whether it's an Inspectorio or a Kima or a Pivot 88, and it's creating transparency through the entire supply chain. So now that data is evident, and then if someone else tries to onboard, another retailer tries to come on, they already have it. So it's becoming, you're seeing some of this, but to your point, it needs to be adopted by more retailers and brands for it to really be effective. And I think that the question is, why is that not happening? You know, why is this industry not being pushed to make these changes?
So, well, it's not being pushed to make these changes for several reasons. One is that there's no external catalyst holding a stake. Okay, that's one. That may come with the new laws in Europe. The other is there's no internal champion, right? Inside pushing it. There are some new developments like the Social and Labor Convergence Project, which is sort of trying to do something like unify audits, you know, have one-way audits that people can access. But that solves part of the problem, but it doesn't solve the whole problem, because all of that data is should be shared, and SLCP is planning to have them shared in some data hosting. But even having the data there doesn't mean that people will use it. Okay? And my experience of the apparel industry is that there are platforms like SEDEX, etc., which have all of this data, but they don't analyze it. And there's a big question as to why they don't do that. And partly is that maybe there is a lack of talent in this industry that is focused on this kind of thing. I mean, if you were a really smart data job, masters in data analysis or something, you finished from, let's say, NYU, where would you go? Would you go to Google, or would you go and work in the back offices of an apparel company?
Well, this goes way beyond compliance. This is a conversation I've had many times over, and it's not a knock to anyone working in this business. I myself have been in this business for a long time, but you're 100% right. If you're a data scientist coming out of Stanford, do I want the stock options and the opportunity to go to Instagram, or do I want to be at JCPenney's?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You could say this for a lot of skills and a lot of jobs that this industry needs. It's going to it's going to be difficult to recruit, but we're going to need to do that to stay relevant.
Yeah.
One question I have, as I was reading through a lot of your material, is you use this word opacity a lot. Now, obviously, I know what the definition of something being opaque is, but what is opacity? What makes a field opaque in the context that you're speaking of?
Yeah.
And why is it that the global apparel industry is so opaque? And is it really that different than other sectors from that we're talking about?
Yeah. So I think that opaqueness is a key element of my book, and I try to sort of show different ways in which opaqueness is created. But I mean, to go away from the industry for a moment, to sort of talk about an industry that is not transparent, and that's, I'm sure most people here are familiar with it, is this whole idea of business school education, right? Everybody knows that if you go to a business school, they teach using the case method, right? Because that's become this like the model. And yeah, it was maybe developed by Harvard and Northwestern or whatever, but every business school now uses the case method because it is proven to be a way to engage and build the analytical talents of MBA students around the world. Okay, so you have a cause and an effect that is clear, and therefore everybody adopts. In the apparel industry space, no company shares publicly its data about what it is doing to improve compliance way back in the factory in Bangladesh. They don't tell you how it is organized. They don't tell you how within the company there's a connection between sourcing and compliance and so on and so forth. There's no data, which is the beginning of the problem. The second, there are three drivers, if you like, about opaqueness. One is behavioral invisibility. We've talked about this, the difficulty in actually measuring supplier behavior because you have a lousy auditing system or because the data is falsified. You have practice multiplicity, where you have different programs or looking at different standards, where you have different companies sourcing from the same factory, following different programs, different ratings, different things. And you have this problem about causal complexity, which is that it's hard to identify cause and effect and how that cause and effect may change from place to place, right? So, for example, one of the key golden rules, if you like, in the private regulation industry is that if we have leverage over the factory, you can make the factory perform. It's like, as if you are supposed to have more leverage if you own 100% of the factories out, right? Therefore, you can make them perform. And this may or may not be true, because conditions in a factory are due to many things, not just leverage. And we find that, being a good labor guy from a labor relations school, we find that the reason why things work in factories are a number of things. Maybe there's a union there, maybe there's good quality management. All of these things matter to improve compliance. Leverage alone doesn't. And we have studies to show that, when you put them all into a regression equation to sort of see which one works, leverage is not significant at all.
So there's so many audience questions and comments coming through. I want to hop over to that in a minute, but one thing we didn't talk about is, all we talked about is the private sector's involvement in this. Is there a play for the government to get involved?
Yes, absolutely. So in an ideal world, it would be each national country government to be getting involved. But the whole problem started because poor countries' governments were not enforcing their law for good reason. I mean, they needed to focus on economic development and attracting foreign investment in a globalized world where companies can move labor arbitrage-wise, across the globe. So it left many developing countries in a bind, and sort of one way to capitalize on their labor cost advantage, which is their source of comparative advantage, they would turn a blind eye on labor abuse, right? So that was a source of the problem. But things are slowly beginning to change now, where even some developing country governments do realize that, that they might turn this into an advantage by sort of having basic laws. The government of Vietnam recently was, made some moves in that direction. Then there are laws in the advanced countries, the countries where the big brands are, and all over Europe, the governments are active. France, 2017, Germany this year, there's been a lot of traffic on the internet toward Germany and German due diligence law today, and the EU as a whole. So governments here have a role to play, and let's get some very basic idea here. All countries are members of the United Nations and the ILO. All countries, by virtue of being a member of the ILO, we've agreed to be good international citizens, right? That's why we are part of an international body. And one of the key things about being an international citizen is to sort of say, we will all respect basic core fundamental rights, rights that you accrue to people because you're simply human, right? And so that's what we are asking companies to do. So there is a role for government, international regulation, to sort of say this is a basic, right? Otherwise, we're really not being in sync with the whole idea of humanity in some way.
So, I have my own opinion on unions and collective bargaining. So take my opinions aside. Data does show it works in many cases, but this is clearly not a priority for brands. Why is that the case if there is data to support it working, especially at the factories, side? So, I think we have to be realistic about collective bargaining. I think there's very clear data, and I'm not the only one that has done it. We have 100 years worth of data since our basic laws about collective bargaining came in, saying that where collective bargaining operates in most industries,
it improves labor conditions, right? That's clear. So, but what we are dealing with is opposition to unions and collective bargaining because employers feel that they're taking away the employer's ability to manage. In the supply chain space, it becomes even more complicated because the brands have in their code of conduct, they say support for freedom of association, but the manager in the factory sees freedom of association as impinging on his or her right to manage. So it is complicated. But so we can potentially convince the brands that, hey, you want to improve compliance, here's a surefire method. And that surefire method works wherever we've tested it. Wherever there's data which we've tested, so factories with collective bargaining agreements always have better conditions than factories that don't. Okay, so but that's not the only solution. I mean, quality of management makes a big difference. So there are other variables in the mix, but collective bargaining would be a simpler variable for the brands, because once brands actually have pushed, once there's collective bargaining in the factories, a lot of the other compliance problems get solved through that method. So it's a means to an end as well, apart from being an end in itself.
Mm-hmm. How much of a problem, we all know this is very prevalent, is subcontracting. You have tens of thousands, hundreds, there's so many hidden suppliers. Even the best factories in the world, let's be honest, when you get overbooked, you start to subcontract. And that opens, again, Pandora's box. Very hard to trace. And a lot of times the paperwork is originating from, like you said, that final factory that's finishing the goods. You have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. This past year, no one could go anywhere. But even in the best of times, the head of CSR, your audit team goes to this factory. How do you track these factories every single day when subcontracting is happening?
Yeah. So basically the answer is you cannot, right? But there are efforts afoot using the technology that you were asking me about earlier. So there's a company out in California that is developing some kind of a DNA test for a sweatshirt. Mm-hmm. Because then you can actually go and do tests of the atmosphere in certain factories, and then you can do a sweatshirt to sort of test of the sweatshirt to see whether this sweatshirt was made in that particular factory. And the argument is that the conditions in each of the factories differ, right? Okay, so this is a technology-based argument for trying to figure out whether there's subcontracting is going on, and I don't think it really is working. So I think that the bigger answer is to sort of understand, just how bad this problem might be. And the way you do that is to look at factories from the factory side and sort of look at what kind of orders are they getting and how often is that late. Because we want to sort of identify to what extent is the problem caused by lousy purchasing practices of brands, right? And we can then link. So actually, I have some really nice data that kind of shows the volatility on a day-to-day basis of orders coming into a factory, the supplier that I'm studying in Indonesia. And we can sort of see that volatility is very large, but we can also sort of see how many times the order is coming late. And this factory has about 10 buyers. So we can see by buyer. And sure enough, when the orders are late, the factory is, fully running at full capacity, there is no option but to subcontract to meet the order. And so this is where a close, good relationship between buyer and supplier, where the supplier will have to tell the buyer, look, your order came in late, I'm subcontracting to this factory, you're welcome to come and look at it, it's a good factory, there's the only kinds of factories. But that kind of partnership and trust is required for solving the subcontracting problem. Otherwise, this can't be solved.
Right. So, one of the questions that I saw come in is, why is fragmentation such an issue in the apparel industry versus the electronic industry? And what lessons can we learn from in electronics that could be
it's really hard
to those in the apparel industry?
It's very hard to transfer right? That knowledge, because the cost of entry into the apparel industry is tiny, right? I mean, all you need, you buy 10 sewing machines, you're a factory, right? And you can take on subcontracting from work. The cost of entry to manufacture semiconductors is massive, which is why there are only so many semiconductor manufacturers in the world. And this is this is why Apple is in hock to 2 suppliers, Foxconn and another one in Taiwan. So, so the cost of entry is very, very low in apparel, much, much higher in electronics. And that's one of the reasons. It's a very big reason. The second is that the cost of entry being so low drives many, many poor countries to start this. And this is, economic development of countries today is not just a choice between, in import substitution, industrialization, and export-oriented industrialization. It is, how do we get onto the back end of a global supply chain? So, some countries specialize in cocoa, Ivory Coast and Ghana. Some countries specialize in flowers, Colombia and Kenya. These are all back ends of supply chains, and that's the way they develop. And many countries specialize in garments because it's the easiest to get into. You can't export flowers just from Cambodia easily, but that's not a part of their natural endowments. So global economic relations and development is often, for poor countries, is tied into being in the back end of a global supply chain.
So there's another question I personally wanted to ask you, and it just came through on the feed. So I'm going to summarize part of it. Obviously after Rana Plaza, the Accord and the Alliance came to be, and I'd be interested to know what are your thoughts on this type of agreements? Do you think there was any positive effects?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the Accord and the Alliance, is an example of what in my book I call a niche institution, which is an institution that has been created that solves the problem of collaboration in a competitive environment, right? Because 200 brands came together together for the first time. So it solves collaboration issues. And secondly, it had a very clear, narrow focus, and that they were going to remediate factories. Right? And that's it. They were not going to look at labor conditions, they were not going to look at all kinds of things, but they would only primarily look at factory remediation. Was it successful? There is no question that it was successful. I mean, we have 2 signings of the Accord. The first one lasted for 5 years. The current one is lasting for 3. And during this time, the number of factories that have been fixed, that from the group that were factories that they originally looked at, steadily improved. So you can sort of say for those factories, fire hazards are no longer an issue. So there is no question.
So there is progress. You said it's a niche example of progress, but this is there.
Yeah,
there was good that has come out of those agreements. So we've lumped apparel. We keep talking about the fashion, but apparel and footwear are a little bit different. As you said before, the barrier to entry to knit a T-shirt. I mean, we could literally set up some sewing machines behind me and be in business tonight. To do that for footwear is very hard. Primarily China. Vietnam is definitely number 2, but it's harder it takes a lot of investment. It's a different skill set. It's harder to move. Okay, a little bit in Mexico, Portugal, Italy. So it's not as an easy, within the sector, it's a harder category to get into. Because of that, are you seeing less compliance issues in footwear versus apparel?
Yeah, so definitely yes, and for a variety of reasons. One is that the number of footwear manufacturers is actually tiny.
Right.
In fact, one of the biggest is Pao Chen, and Pao Chen is the world's leader in footwear manufacturing, right? And so they have the technical expertise. They also have large numbers of factories that they set up in various parts of Asia. And footwear factories tend to be dedicated to a brand, mostly. It's relatively rare to find a factory that produces for 10 different brands at the same time. They tend to be far more dedicated. And the relationships between footwear factories and their brands are generally much better. And on average, compliance, if you're looking at compliance as the measure of interest, is better in those factories. Yeah.
So it's another question that came very early on, but I'm going to summarize it and throw another thing into it. Do you think CSR and sustainability, I'm making a very general statement, but I'd like to know your feedback here. Do you really think it's done with the purest intentions of a better world, a better workforce, or is it to make the brands look better so consumers feel better to align with them and ultimately make more money? Now, there are outliers. There are B Corps. There are certain companies that are truly part of their DNA and ethos, and I want to just put those aside for a second because I don't want them to feel like we're attacking them. But for the most part, like I said before, it's just a greenwashing and goodwashing campaign, especially with Generation Z. They like to find brands that align with their values. And like I said, we're going to see a lot of marketing going towards these claims. But the companies at the end of the day are sitting in a boardroom saying, how are we going to make the most amount of money? We're going to do this by changing the labeling, the packaging, but it's not really done with the heart. It's being done with the wallet.
Right. So, yeah, okay. So let's keep B Corps aside for a moment. But if you look at, the reasons why there's a lack of compliance, when I look at it, I sort of argue that there's two kinds of decoupling that is going on, right, in the industry. One is what we call policy practice decoupling, and the other one is practice outcomes decoupling. Okay, so the first type, policy practice decoupling, is that companies will adopt a policy, a private regulation policy, and not really worry about implementing it, primarily because they sort of say, hey, we just want to look good. It gives us legitimacy to say that we have this policy, but ultimately, fundamentally, we're just interested in making money, right? And so we don't implement it, don't take it seriously, but we can show everybody, hey, we got a policy. And then there's practice outcomes decoupling. These are companies who actually, have realized that addressing these issues is crucial to them. They're making more money, right? And maybe these are companies that speak to a higher order of customer in terms of capacity to pay, but who for them doing some of this is not just, policy practice, symbolic adoption. Well, they need to have to do something in order to satisfy their client base. Mm-hmm. And increasingly with that shift from baby boomers to Gen Z, which is the greatest wealth transfer that we've ever heard about, and the Gen Z guys, making the decisions in the future, many companies are very, very serious about it. So they realize that they have to do this in order to sort of meet the next generation of customers.
If they don't do it, there's without question, look, is there an instant ROI today? Maybe not, but without it, they won't be relevant. They're selling DVDs to a market that's streaming music. It's the inevitability.
And that's why, so that's why I'm really interested in some of these companies, because they're practicing it, right? They're really serious about implementing it. They're still not getting results, which is what drove me to study this in the first place.
So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we have an hour, but there's one more question that kind of follows up on the union question. I think it's interesting, your take on unions and the data that supports it. So I like to read it. It's a little long, but I want to read it. I'd love to hear your take on it before we conclude. And we'll make sure that for all the attendees and everyone that wrote comments in, we'll make sure that Sarosh has them to review and to get back to anyone. And we really appreciate all of the audience's participation. There's such good comments here, Sarosh, to look at. So the question is, could you talk a bit more about the potential for unionization in the garment industry? While the supply chain dynamics make it hard to unionize and managers are reluctant to give up control to unions, there are some trends in favor of unionization. Some brands like H&M publish trade unionization rates in their supplier factories, and both international unions, like industrial and domestic unions, have been involved in private governance initiatives. Do you think there is any potential for brands and international unions to promote unionization efforts specifically in the industry? Long one.
Okay. So we have examples of a couple of brands, let's say H&M and Zara, for example, who have reached an agreement with a global union about a framework agreement that, about unionization and collective bargaining in the supply chain. The problem is with that agreement is that it's a very framework level. It's required at the top, but its implementation down the chain has been poor. I think that the hope to have a union in every garment factory in the world, however laudable that is, and I'd love to see that, is not going to happen. And the way you solve this problem is like the way this problem has been solved in 120 years of industrialization, is to have the problem at the level of the entire industry. You have a collective bargaining agreement at the level of the industry. That's what should be the focus. And to that, it's a meso level. It's not at the global level, like the Zara agreement is. And it's not at the factory level. It's a level in between, which should be the focus. That is exactly the focus of that group called the ACT, which is 20 brands coming together with an international union to sort of say, let's do this in Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, and other places. And I think that there's traction there.
Right. So I have one final question. First, I do want to thank you for inviting me. I'm flattered to be part of this great moment for you. So my last question is, obviously, other than buying the book as the first step to learn more, what is the path forward? What do you recommend? Obviously, we've outlined a lot of problems. There's a lot of obstacles. We know it's a very complex supply chain. So we all know that. For people listening, though, they're saying, okay, great. We talked a lot about problems. We got a couple of potential solutions. I'm sitting here right now. I'm a brand or retailer. I'm in charge of CSR. I'm on the board. I'm a C-level executive. Dan, Sarosh made a lot of good points. I leave this call today. What's the path forward?
So a big problem, it's not possible for anybody to attack all of the causes of that problem. So I'm not going to go there. I leave the people who want to change, force developing country governments to enforce their laws. That's one thing, that's all. I leave that to people who are more capable of doing that. So my focus has been on sort of saying, the puzzle that I'm trying to solve is why companies who are really serious about a private regulation system are not seeing the results. That's what I want to solve. And my solution is that, look, institutional theory, which is a valued theory that we use, tells us that if we are able to get disclosure of best practices, what works, right, then everybody will begin to follow them, right? And so that people follow best practices for a couple of reasons. One is they're coerced into following the best practice, right? And you might get coerced by a government, you might get coerced by your customers, right? The other one is mimicry. I mean, people just like to follow best practices. They know that somebody is doing it better than you. Hey, we're going to do the same thing. And this is global, right? And the third is that, if you're serious about this stuff, where do you go and get your information? You go and get if you're a sustainability manager, you go to sustainability conferences, right? You hear, you talk. And if at those conferences, there was analysis of data and best practices, you would get that. So there is strong institutional theory reasons for why companies would adopt best practices. Mm-hmm. My central message is, look, companies, share your data, share your analysis, or give your data anonymously to various places around the world that actually do this analysis so that we can get the best practices out there and we can disseminate this information. So
we'd be happy to publish it as well. We'd be happy. Yeah. Exactly. We take no side. We just want to better the industry. Anna, I want to thank you for opening up today's event. Sarosh, congratulations. A really great conversation. And to everyone that attended, I appreciate you taking the time to join us. Be well. And Sarosh, hopefully next time we do this, we'll be face to face. I can't wait to have a cup of coffee or a dinner in person again soon.
Right. Thank you very much.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.